In 1999, in Pickering, Ontario, the British audio giant NAD Electronics was quietly absorbed by a Canadian distribution company. A brand that had sold over 1 million units of the legendary 3020 amplifier was now owned by the very people who used to load it onto delivery trucks. Audiophiles lost the illusion of British independence. Competitors lost their most dangerous independent rival. But the engineers kept their jobs, and the minimalist gray amplifiers kept arriving in hi-fi dealers and basement rec rooms across North America. The paradox is that NAD did not survive because it doubled down on its European roots. It survived because a Canadian distributor realized that controlling the manufacturing was the only way to protect the supply chain. But the real story of Lenbrook is not just the story of a 1999 acquisition. It is the story of how an Ontario office built the ultimate hardware alliance with NAD and PSB speakers, just as the digital revolution was preparing to render traditional hardware obsolete. Every week, we tell the stories of Canadian speakers, amplifiers, and audio groups that once shaped how people heard music, and what happened when the market moved on. Subscribe if that history matters to you. The story begins not with a global acquisition, but with a quiet warehouse in Pickering, Ontario, in 1978. In 1978, the Canadian audio market was a vast, unforgiving landscape. To understand why a distribution company in Pickering, Ontario, would eventually hold the keys to a global audio empire, it is necessary to look at the physical reality of selling stereo equipment in Canada during the late 1970s. The country was geographically massive, yet its population was spread incredibly thin. Moving heavy, fragile wooden cabinets and sensitive electronics from a manufacturer to a living room required an immense logistical effort. At the time, the market was flooded with Japanese electronics and American loudspeakers, but getting those products across the border, navigating Canadian tariffs, and shipping them thousands of miles to independent hi-fi dealers in Calgary, Vancouver, or Halifax added layers of cost. A high-end amplifier imported from Europe or the United States often became prohibitively expensive by the time it reached a Canadian showroom. The market lacked a centralized, highly efficient distribution network that could curate serious audio equipment and deliver it to local music stores without destroying the price tag. That was the void David S. Simmons saw when he founded Lenbrook. Operating out of Pickering, a suburb east of Toronto, the company began as a distributor of consumer electronics. Simmons understood that in the Canadian market, the company that controlled the logistics controlled the shelf space. A hi-fi dealer sent Chesteria hi-fi deal bulb ducky, a specialized retail shop where customers could sit in dedicated listening rooms to audition equipment, relied entirely on what the distributor could consistently deliver, service, and guarantee. But moving boxes was only a mechanical process. The true power of a distributor lay in choosing which boxes were worth moving. At the same time Lenbrook was building its national network, a young Canadian engineer named Paul Barton was trying to solve a different problem. Barton was a violinist and a designer who had founded PSB speakers. He was one of the first audio designers to utilize the acoustic research facilities at the National Research Council, or NRC, in Ottawa. By placing his early prototypes inside an anechoic chamber, a specialized test room completely lined with fiberglass wedges designed to absorb all sound reflections, Barton could measure exactly how a loudspeaker behaved without the interference of walls or furniture. Barton's research proved that a speaker, a device that turns an electrical audio signal into sound moving through air, did not have to be a guessing game. It could be engineered to a strict, measurable standard of flat frequency response, ensuring it reproduced low, middle, and high sounds evenly. The science was undeniable. The commercial reality, however, was brutal. A perfectly measured speaker sitting in an Ottawa lab could not generate revenue until it was placed in a living room. Barton had the engineering, But expanding a manufacturing base and supplying a continent-wide network of stereo dealers required capital and logistical muscle that a small speaker laboratory simply did not possess. Lenbrook recognized the value of the NRC measurement culture. They partnered with PSB Speakers, becoming their national distributor. This alliance connected Canadian acoustic research directly to Canadian retail logistics. Suddenly, the hi-fi dealer in Montreal did not just have a speaker to sell. They had a speaker backed by government-funded acoustic science, delivered reliably by a distributor who understood retail margins. But a speaker cannot make sound without power. It requires an amplifier, an electronic device that increases a weak audio signal so it can drive the speaker's physical components. And in the late 1970s, the amplifier market was engaged in a visual war. Japanese consumer electronics giants were dominating dealer shelves with massive receivers, an amplifier with a radio tuner and source controls built into the same unit. These receivers were marketed on their appearance and specifications. They featured brushed silver faceplates, heavy dials, glowing blue meters, and dozens of buttons. They looked impressive in a catalog, but much of the manufacturing cost went into the chassis and the lights rather than the internal power supply. Across the Atlantic, a radical alternative was taking shape. A group of audio industry veterans in London, England, had formed New Acoustic Dimension, known as NAD. Their philosophy was the exact opposite of the Japanese receiver trend. They believed all the manufacturing budget should go into the internal circuitry, leaving the exterior as basic as possible. The result was the NAD 3020. It was an integrated amplifier, a preamp and power amp combined in one single chassis. It was small. It was housed in a dark gray, utilitarian metal box. It had a simple plastic power button and basic tone controls. Beside the towering, glowing silver receivers on a Canadian hi-fi dealer's shelf, the 3020 looked almost like a toy. Lenbrook secured the rights to distribute NAD in Canada, and they faced an immediate problem at the retail level. A Lenbrook sales representative traveling to a stereo shop in Toronto or Edmonton had to convince a seasoned dealer to take a chance on a boring gray box that produced a modest 20 watts per channel on paper, while the silver receiver sitting next to it claimed 50 watts. The breakthrough happened in the listening room. The dealer would hook the unassuming gray NAD 3020 up to a demanding pair of speakers. When the music played, the small amplifier did not falter. It controlled the woofer, the large driver designed to reproduce low frequencies, with a grip and authority that the flashy, specification-heavy receivers often lacked when pushed hard. The NAD was designed to handle real-world electrical loads, not just pass a laboratory test resistor. It was an affordable piece of equipment that genuinely sounded like high-end audio. By the 1980s, a quiet synthesis had occurred within the Pickering warehouse. Lenbrook was distributing the meticulously measured PSB loudspeakers, and they were distributing the high-value, minimalist NAD amplifiers. Dealers began pairing them together. A Canadian customer could walk into a local audio showroom, spend a very reasonable amount of money, and walk out with a gray NAD amplifier and a pair of wooden PSB speakers. That specific combination became the default high-fidelity standard for thousands of Canadian basement rec rooms, university dormitories, and apartment living rooms. The distributor had accidentally curated an ecosystem. They were no longer just moving cargo, they were defining what Canadian hi-fi sounded like. But distributing another nation's breakthrough was merely an apprenticeship for what the Pickering office would have to do when the global market fractured. The true breakthrough for the Lenbrook Group did not happen in a boardroom. It happened in the listening room, where two entirely different engineering philosophies were forced to work together to solve a retail crisis. On one side was the physical acoustic design happening in Canada. Paul Barton had spent years inside the National Research Council facilities in Ottawa, trying to solve a very specific problem. The audio industry already knew how to build a good, expensive speaker. Barton wanted to know if the strict measurement protocols of the NRC could be applied to a speaker that almost anyone could afford. The result was the PSB Alpha. Released in the early 1990s, the Alpha did not look like a revolution. It was a compact bookshelf speaker, wrapped in basic black ash vinyl, measuring barely a foot tall. But inside the cabinet, the wooden or composite box that holds the drivers and shapes how the speaker interacts with the air, Barton had achieved something rare. The secret was the crossover. An electrical network inside a speaker that sends bass, mid-range, and treble to the drivers designed to handle them. In most budget speakers of the era, the crossover was an afterthought, built from cheap parts, leading to a harsh, fatiguing sound. Barton used his NRC measurement data to perfectly align the half-inch tweeter, a small driver designed to reproduce high frequencies such as cymbals, strings, and vocal detail, with a basic 6.5-inch woofer. Because the transition between the two drivers was seamlessly measured in an anechoic chamber, the Alpha produced a massive, accurate soundstage. The perceived width, depth, and placement of music created by a stereo system. A pair of Alphas retailed for roughly 200 Canadian dollars. It was a price that completely broke the traditional audiophile barrier to entry. But a speaker cannot operate in isolation. It is a passive device. To reach its potential, the Alpha needed an amplifier that could control it without adding distortion, unwanted change added to the sound by the speaker, amplifier, source, or room. This was where the second half of the Pickering Alliance provided the exact missing piece. While Barton was measuring speakers in Ottawa, NAD's engineers were obsessed with how an amplifier behaved in the real world rather than on a test bench. When a speaker reproduces music, its impedance, the electrical load a speaker presents to an amplifier, constantly changes with the frequency of the sound. When a heavy bass drum hits, the speaker demands a massive, sudden surge of electrical current. Mass-market Japanese receivers, built to look impressive in a catalog, often used cheap, lightweight power supplies. When the music demanded current, the receiver would choke, and the sound would collapse into a harsh, metallic mess. NAD took the opposite approach. They poured the manufacturing budget into massive, heavy internal transformers, an electrical part in some amplifiers that changes voltage and helps supply power. They developed technologies like the power envelope circuit, which allowed a modestly rated amplifier to deliver massive bursts of short-term power to handle musical peaks. An NAD amplifier might be conservatively rated at 20 or 30 watts per channel on paper, but because of its high current design, it could grip a speaker's voice coil, the coil of wire attached to the speaker cone that moves when electricity passes through it, with absolute authority. When Lenbrook's sales network began placing the PSB Alpha and the entry-level NAD amplifiers in the same retail environments, the effect was transformative. The timing was critical. The market was shifting. The compact disc had replaced the turntable in the Canadian living room, a CD player. A machine that reads a compact disc and turns its digital data into music possessed a much wider dynamic range than vinyl. It could go from absolute silence to a massive dynamic strike in a fraction of a second. This new digital reality exposed the weaknesses of cheap speakers and weak receivers. Harsh tweeters sounded brutal. Weak amplifiers clipped violently. The NAD and PSB pairing survived this digital shift effortlessly. The NAD amplifier had the high current stability to make the PSB woofer sound tight and physical. The PSB crossover was smooth enough to reveal the clean, uncolored nature of the NAD's circuitry. Together, they created a stereo image, the illusion that sounds come from places between and around two speakers, that rivaled systems costing 3 or 4 times as much. For the Canadian audio retail system, this combination was a lifeline. Independent stereo shops across the country were facing massive pressure from big box retailers. Places like Future Shop were selling walls of flashing, oversized electronics stacked to the ceiling. A local hi-fi dealer in Montreal, a boutique audio showroom in Vancouver, or an institution like Bloor Radio in Toronto needed a way to prove that specialty audio was still worth the customer's time. The Lenbrook combination gave those dealers a lethal demonstration tool. A salesperson could walk a university student or a young family into a dedicated listening room. They would connect the small, unassuming PSB alphas to the minimalist gray NAD amplifier. They would play a well-recorded CD. The customer would hear a massive, detailed, physical wall of sound. They would look around the room for a hidden subwoofer, a speaker designed to reproduce very low bass frequencies, only to realize the sound was coming entirely from the two small boxes on the stands. Then, the salesperson would reveal the price. For roughly $500, a Canadian buyer could own a legitimate, lab-proven hi-fi system. This was not just a retail victory, it was a structural shift. Lenbrook was no longer a middleman moving boxes across the country. By holding the distribution rights to the perfect amplifier and partnering with the perfect domestic speaker, the Pickering office had created an ecosystem. They were feeding hundreds of independent dealers a product that the big box stores could not match, at a price the mass market could actually afford. Sales volumes skyrocketed. The revenue flowing through the Pickering warehouse gave the company a level of capital and influence that far exceeded its original mandate. The laboratory proof and the dealer margins had aligned perfectly, creating a financial engine that allowed Pickering to look far beyond the Canadian border. The success of the 1990s created a new, invisible danger. By the end of the decade, the Lenbrook Group had built a remarkably efficient commercial machine. The Pickering warehouse was moving thousands of wooden speaker cabinets designed in Ottawa and thousands of minimalist gray amplifiers designed in London. Canadian dealers were thriving. The system worked perfectly. But that strength would become the trap. A distributor, no matter how powerful, does not own the factory. A distributor does not control the patents, the global trademarks, or the engineering roadmap. A distributor is entirely dependent on the survival of the badge bolted to the front of the box. In the late 1990s, the global hi-fi industry was experiencing a brutal wave of corporate consolidation. Independent British, American, and European audio brands were being systematically swallowed by multinational conglomerates, private equity firms, and massive consumer electronics groups. NAD Electronics was internationally famous. The 3020 amplifier had cemented its legacy, but fame did not guarantee financial stability in a volatile global market. The British brand had navigated multiple ownership changes, offshore manufacturing transitions, and immense economic pressure. For the executives sitting in the Pickering office, the mathematics of the situation were terrifying. If NAD stumbled, or worse, if it was acquired by a giant corporation that decided to dilute its engineering philosophy to chase mass-market retail, the impact on Lenbrook would be catastrophic. The entire Canadian retail network that Lenbrook had painstakingly built relied on the steady, reliable flow of those high-current amplifiers. Without NAD, the PSB speakers would lose their perfect, affordable partner on the showroom floor. The independent hi-fi dealer in Calgary, the boutique audio shop in Montreal, and the major stereo retailer in Toronto would suddenly have a massive, unfillable gap in their inventory. The problem was not the Canadian consumer. The problem was the fragility of the global supply chain. The Pickering executives understood the systemic risk. They could not afford to let an outside holding company dictate the future of their most important electronic asset. In 1999, Lenbrook made a decision that fundamentally altered the Canadian audio landscape. They did not just negotiate a new, stricter distribution contract. They bought the entire brand. The Canadian distributor outright acquired NAD Electronics. Simultaneously, the long-standing, deeply intertwined relationship with Paul Barton deepened even further, bringing PSB speakers fully under the Lenbrook corporate umbrella. This was a staggering reversal of the usual industry narrative. Historically, a Canadian audio brand was built up in a local lab, achieved a brief moment of international success, and was then quietly sold to an American or European conglomerate before fading away. Lenbrook did the exact opposite. They used the capital generated by years of disciplined domestic distribution to buy an international legend. The physical reality of the Pickering operation transformed overnight. It was no longer merely a domestic logistics hub managing shipping routes between Ontario and British Columbia. It was now a global headquarters commanding an international supply chain. The Canadian executives suddenly had to manage acoustic research driven out of the National Research Council in Ottawa, electronic engineering heritage maintained by teams in London, and vast manufacturing contracts across specialized factories in Asia. They had to ensure that the heat sink, metal fins designed to draw heat away from delicate internal amplifier components, specified by a British engineer, was properly sourced and installed on an assembly line halfway across the world before being loaded onto a container ship bound for Canada. The acquisition meant that the risk was now entirely theirs. If a factory line slowed down, if a parts supplier failed to deliver a specific transformer, or if a global currency fluctuated wildly, it was Lenbrook's margin that suffered. But they had secured the asset. The amplifier and the speaker were safe from outside interference. By absorbing the brands they once merely transported, Lenbrook had built an impenetrable wall around their ecosystem. They now possessed the complete hardware formula. They controlled the acoustic science, they controlled the electronic power, and they controlled the trucks that delivered it all to the listening room. By the early 2000s, the scale of the operation running out of Pickering had become staggering. Lenbrook was now managing a global distribution network that spanned more than 80 countries. They were not just shipping to independent Canadian stereo shops anymore, they were supplying the world. The sheer physical mass of this enterprise was difficult to comprehend. To maintain the affordable high-end promise of both NAD and PSB, Lenbrook had to master international manufacturing. Producing heavy wooden cabinets and dense electronic circuitry entirely in Canada or the United Kingdom was no longer economically viable if the end product was going to remain accessible to a university student or a middle-class family. Instead, the engineering remained tightly controlled by Paul Barton in Ottawa and the NAD electronic design teams, while the physical construction was shifted to specialized factories in Asia. This required a monumental logistical effort. Every week, massive shipping containers crossed the Pacific Ocean. They were packed with thousands of MDF speaker cabinets, medium-density fiberboard, a heavy, acoustically inert wood product used to build the speaker box. They carried thousands of minimalist gray amplifiers, loaded with heavy copper transformers and precisely machined heat sinks. The Pickering office had to orchestrate this entire ballet of heavy metal and wood. A delay at a port, a sudden shortage of a specific internal component, or a miscalculation in shipping weight could instantly starve a dealer network in Europe or North America. But the logistics held. The system was remarkably efficient. Because of this controlled, predictable supply chain, the Lenbrook combination became an unstoppable retail force. In a specialized hi-fi dealer room in Montreal, a boutique audio showroom in Calgary, or an independent music store in Halifax, the sales strategy was perfected. The salesperson did not have to construct a complex multi-brand theory to convince a buyer. They simply placed a disc into an NAD/CD player, ran the signal through the matching high-current amplifier, and drove a pair of PSB towers. This was the absolute peak of the physical media era. The compact disc was generating massive global revenue, and listeners wanted domestic systems that could actually reveal the pristine dynamics of their CD collections without costing a small fortune. The impact on Canadian listening culture was profound. In the classic Canadian basement rec room, a finished lower-level space where families gathered to watch films and teenagers congregated to listen to music, this equipment became part of the architectural background. The electronics sat inside heavy, particle-board entertainment units. The speakers stood like monoliths on either side of the room. They were physical, dependable objects. When a listener pushed the power button on an NAD amplifier, an internal relay engaged with a loud, mechanical, satisfying click. When the amplifier demanded current, it drew real power from the wall. When a heavy bass track hit, the woofer visibly moved air, vibrating the floorboards of the room. Audio was still a deeply mechanical experience, bound by the physical limits of moving parts, heavy materials, and physical discs. The Pickering office was no longer just a participant in the Canadian audio industry. It had become the central nervous system for a massive, international listening culture dictating how millions of people physically interacted with sound. Lenbrook had solved the ultimate problem of the audio hardware supply chain. They had proven that a Canadian distribution company could buy its way out of retail vulnerability by taking absolute ownership of the engineering and the manufacturing. The independent hi-fi dealers were making money. The Asian factory lines were running at peak capacity. The acoustic measurements from the Ottawa lab were being validated in living rooms across the globe. Lenbrook had built the ultimate hardware alliance, but the compact disc was about to give way to an invisible signal that hardware alone could not decode. The first fracture in the Pickering audio empire did not start with a factory closure or a sudden collapse in engineering quality. It began as a quiet architectural shift inside the Canadian living room. By the early 2000s, the traditional stereo system, the exact configuration that Lenbrook had spent 20 years perfecting, was losing its central place in the home. For decades, a dedicated hi-fi dealer could easily convince a customer to dedicate floor space to a pair of wooden tower speakers and a heavy metal amplifier. But the arrival of the DVD changed how families consumed media. The market no longer wanted a stereo image. They wanted surround sound. This technological shift forced a brutal transition upon the industry. Customers suddenly demanded an AV processor, a home theater control unit that decodes surround formats and manages multiple channels of audio. They wanted 5 speakers and a subwoofer rather than 2 perfectly measured stereo cabinets. For a mass-market electronics brand, this was an opportunity to sell more boxes. For Lenbrook, it was an engineering nightmare. NAD's entire identity was built on high current power, massive internal transformers, and minimalist signal paths. Building a 2-channel amplifier with this philosophy was highly cost-effective and sonically pure. But attempting to pack 5 or 7 channels of heavy, high-current amplification into a single receiver chassis generated immense heat and required massive, expensive heat sinks. While Japanese competitors were using cheap, lightweight digital chips to sell surround sound receivers for $500 at big box stores, a properly engineered NAD home theater receiver was vastly heavier, ran much hotter, and was significantly more expensive to produce. The executives in Pickering watched as the retail landscape transformed around them. The independent Canadian hi-fi dealer, the carefully acoustically treated showroom where a trained salesperson could prove the superiority of a PSB Alpha or an NAD amplifier, was losing foot traffic. Buyers were flocking to massive retail warehouses like Future Shop and Best Buy. In these big box environments, audio was not demonstrated. It was displayed. A speaker was stacked on a metal shelf next to a microwave oven. A customer could not hear the smooth transition of a PSB crossover or the unyielding grip of an NAD power supply over the roar of the retail floor. They bought based on the wattage numbers printed in large font on the cardboard box, and they bought based on price. The pressure on the Lenbrook supply chain became immense. Even though actual assembly had been outsourced, the physical reality of traditional hi-fi could not be optimized any further. Shipping thousands of heavy MDF cabinets and copper-laden amplifiers across the Pacific Ocean became a massive financial liability as global fuel and logistics costs rose. To compete with the influx of cheap plastic home theater-in-a-box systems, Lenbrook had to squeeze every possible efficiency out of its Asian manufacturing partners without compromising the strict acoustic standards set by Paul Barton at the National Research Council lab in Ottawa. A speaker could still measure perfectly in the lab and still lose the retail war to a cheaper, lighter alternative that cost a fraction of the price to ship. It was a losing battle against convenience. As the decade progressed, even the multi-speaker home theater system began to feel like too much clutter for the average buyer. The market shifted again, this time toward the soundbar, a single, wide-powered speaker cabinet designed to sit directly beneath a flat-panel television, effectively replacing the need for a separate amplifier and multiple speakers. A soundbar completely bypassed the need for a traditional hi-fi distributor. It did not require heavy-gauge speaker wire, it did not require a carefully matched amplifier, and it certainly did not require an anechoic chamber to prove its worth. It just needed to be louder than the television's built-in speakers and easy to connect. Suddenly, the millions of dollars Lenbrook had invested in mastering the physical synergy between an NAD amplifier and a PSB speaker meant very little to a mass-market consumer who just wanted a single black plastic bar under their screen. The cultural moment that had sustained the company, the Canadian basement rec room anchored by a stack of gray electronics and heavy wooden cabinets, was fading. The equipment was still exceptional. The laboratory measurements from Ottawa were still accurate. The supply chain from Asia to Pickering was still running. But the context around the hardware had changed. Independent stereo shops in Calgary, Vancouver, and Toronto quietly began closing their doors, unable to survive on the dwindling margins of specialized audio. Every time a trusted local dealer locked up for the last time, Lenbrook lost a crucial stage where their physical hardware could be properly explained. The massive shipping containers continued to arrive at the ports, but the retail network required to unload them was shrinking. The Pickering office found themselves holding the absolute pinnacle of 20th century audio engineering, right as the 21st century decided it no longer wanted heavy boxes in the living room. The physical hardware was losing its dominance, but a much more dangerous force was already preparing to eliminate the physical disc entirely. By 2007, the global music industry was fundamentally breaking apart. The smartphone was introduced, and within a few short years, the entire concept of music ownership shifted. Music was no longer a physical object purchased at a Canadian music store and brought home to play on a dedicated CD player. It was an invisible file, streamed from a remote server, compressed for quick transmission, and played through cheap, portable Bluetooth speakers, compact battery-powered cylinders that prioritized wireless convenience over any measurable standard of high fidelity. Suddenly, the entire Lenbrook distribution and manufacturing model was facing an existential threat. For 30 years, their financial power lay in moving physical boxes. They knew how to build a heavy amplifier. They knew how to measure a wooden speaker cabinet in an anechoic chamber. But how does a traditional hi-fi company survive when the product becomes a software stream? In the United States, a new company called Sonos was quietly rewriting the rules of the living room. They were not selling traditional hi-fi separates. They were selling a wireless, multi-room streaming ecosystem. A user could control music in the kitchen, the basement rec room, and the bedroom from a single digital screen. Lenbrook's traditional audiophile customer base looked at this shift with deep suspicion. The core market still demanded heavy Class AB amplifiers and perfect acoustic measurements. But the executives in Pickering looked at the declining foot traffic at massive retail hubs, the changing demographics at places like Babelor Radio in Toronto, and the massive shift in consumer spending. They recognized a terrifying reality. If Lenbrook did not build its own digital platform, their carefully engineered amplifiers and speakers would simply become obsolete, dumb terminals. They would be entirely at the mercy of whatever massive tech giant controlled the phone in the user's pocket. The company made a decision that nearly broke them. They chose to pivot a traditional heavy metal distribution and manufacturing empire into a software development firm. For 7 agonizing years behind the closed doors of the Pickering headquarters, Lenbrook funded a massive, highly secretive research and development project. They were no longer just sourcing copper transformers from Asia or measuring woofer cones in Ottawa. They were hiring software engineers. They were building a complete digital operating system from scratch. The financial burden of this transition was staggering. Designing a traditional stereo amplifier is a relatively finite process. Once the circuit board is finalized and tested, it can be manufactured and sold for a decade without modification. Software, however, is a relentless, bottomless pit of development costs. It requires constant network updates, endless bug fixes, security patches, and complex, expensive licensing negotiations with global streaming services. To fund this massive software operation, Lenbrook had to lean heavily on the continuing sales of NAD and PSB. The traditional hardware had to pay for its own digital replacement. The traditional Canadian hi-fi dealers did not immediately understand it. When a Lenbrook sales representative traveled to a showroom in Montreal or Vancouver to explain that the future of the company was a proprietary digital network, the dealers pushed back. They knew exactly how to sell an NAD amplifier based on its physical weight, its internal heat sinks, and its high current power output. They did not know how to sell an invisible software ecosystem. Furthermore, many legacy audio brands were taking the easy route. Competitors were simply buying off-the-shelf software chips from third-party tech companies and slapping them into their old amplifiers to claim they were wireless. But Lenbrook remembered the lesson of 1999. Just as they had realized they needed to own NAD to protect their hardware supply chain, they now realized they needed to own the software code to protect their digital future. Renting a third-party streaming platform meant giving up control of the listener's experience. They eventually launched the BluOS operating system and an entirely new hardware brand called Bluesound. A Bluesound node, a compact network audio streamer that receives music from online services and sends it to an amplifier, did not look like a traditional NAD product. It was small. It was encased in plastic. It possessed no heavy transformers. It was entirely reliant on a Wi-Fi connection. But internally, it was designed to decode high-resolution audio files that contained significantly more data than a standard compact disc. It was the strict, measurable Canadian audio philosophy, translated into computer code. The timing of the launch was desperate. The old world was rapidly shutting down. The physical media era collapsed. The CD plants went quiet. The local stereo shop emptied out. The printed catalogs disappeared. The massive retail walls fell. The big speakers became too heavy. The amplifiers took up too much space. The old listening habits faded away. The heavy metal boxes that had defined the family business for 30 years were no longer anchors. They were templates for a digital architecture. The transition was brutal, expensive, and fraught with internal risk, but it worked. Today, the Lenbrook Group stands as a profound rarity in the global audio industry, a legacy hardware company that successfully transformed into a modern software platform without losing its original soul or selling its foundational brands. They did not just survive the streaming revolution that decimated so many of their peers. They built the infrastructure to control it. The BluOS operating system, originally written in that Ontario office to solve a hardware crisis, is no longer just used for their own Bluesound wireless speakers or modern NAD digital amplifiers. It has become a dominant, highly respected, high-resolution audio network. Other prestigious international hi-fi brands, companies that possess massive engineering budgets of their own, now pay Lenbrook licensing fees to put Canadian software inside their European and American hardware. The company that began by importing foreign engineering into the Canadian market is now exporting a Canadian digital ecosystem to the rest of the world. But the physical history of Lenbrook's rise has not been erased by their digital success. It lives on vividly in the enthusiast community. On any given day, browse the online classifieds on Canuck Audio Mart, or walk into a vintage audio repair shop in Toronto, Montreal, or Vancouver. You will find early gray NAD integrated amplifiers and black ash PSB tower speakers trading hands with remarkable frequency. There is an entire culture of restoration dedicated to keeping this specific era of Canadian audio alive, precisely because the equipment was built to be serviced rather than thrown away. On repair benches across the country, technicians spend hours recapping the old green circuit boards, replacing old capacitors to restore or stabilize electronic performance, because the underlying high-current circuit design remains fundamentally sound. They source specific rubber and foam materials to re-foam the woofer, replacing a deteriorated foam surround so the speaker cone can move properly again. Because the acoustic measurements Paul Barton made in the National Research Council lab 30 years ago are still mathematically and musically valid today. These components are no longer just consumer electronics. They are generational hand-me-downs. It is entirely common for a Canadian university student today to power a turntable with the exact same NAD amplifier their parents bought in a hi-fi shop in 1989. This vintage gear still matters because it proves a point that modern technology companies often forget. A meticulously measured speaker cabinet and a conservatively rated high-current amplifier do not become obsolete simply because the distribution method for the music changes. The physical laws of acoustics, the displacement of air in a room, and the electrical grip of a massive copper transformer do not require software updates or monthly subscriptions. A pair of fully restored PSB alphas powered by a vintage NAD amplifier will still project a massive, detailed stereo image that can completely embarrass modern, expensive plastic wireless speakers. The original hardware still commands absolute respect in the Canadian listening room because it was built on empirical proof, not just retail convenience. If you visit the Lenbrook headquarters in Pickering today, the building does not look like a traditional heavy manufacturing plant of the 1970s. It is a modern corporate technology center. The massive global shipping routes still exist, and the Asian supply chains still run with clockwork precision. But the most important product moving through the company is no longer strictly physical. It is data. The office that once worried intensely about the shipping weight of MDF cabinets and the retail cost of aluminum heat sinks is now monitoring server loads, network latency, and encrypted digital handshakes across millions of wireless audio devices worldwide. The surprise footnote of the Lenbrook story is the ultimate inversion of the Canadian audio cliché. The traditional melancholic narrative dictates that a Canadian audio company innovates brilliantly, struggles with the brutal economics of global scale, and is eventually absorbed by a foreign conglomerate that dilutes the brand name until it becomes a meaningless logo on a cheap soundbar. Lenbrook aggressively rewrote that script. They started as the domestic middleman. They used the profits of distribution to absorb the foreign legends. And then, when the market shifted, they absorbed the digital future before it could render them irrelevant. They treated their legendary hardware not as a fragile museum exhibit to be protected, but as a solid foundation upon which to build a completely new kind of empire. Audio is no longer just about the physical box in the room. It is about the invisible network that connects those boxes together. But the fundamental goal remains exactly the same as it was in a Canadian stereo shop listening room 4 decades ago: to reproduce the recording with absolute fidelity, without distortion, and at a price that respects the listener. Somewhere in a Canadian basement, a pair of early PSB alpha speakers still stands proudly on metal stands, connected with heavy wire to a gray, minimalist NAD amplifier, the volume knob worn smooth from decades of use. And in the living room above it, a sleek Bluesound streamer quietly pulls high-resolution audio from an invisible global network, both generations of sound anchored by the exact same office in Pickering. See you in the next one.